The dust from Yates Fitzgerald's horse settled behind him like a ghost as he crossed into town, his jaw set with a determination that made the men outside the saloon stop their card game to watch. He had ridden 80 miles through heat that could kill a man, through territory where Comanche raiders still struck at lonely ranches, through his own doubts and the voices of every person who told him he was a fool. And now he was here in Marfa, Texas, with one purpose burning in his chest like a brand. He was going to ask Lydia Kincaid for his daughter's hand in marriage, and he knew without question that nobody, not a single soul in 2 counties, thought he would actually do it. The year was 1878, and West Texas was still wild enough that a man could disappear and never be found, but civilized enough that a proposal required proper asking. Yates had known Lydia Kincaid for 2 years now, ever since that autumn day when he had driven cattle through Marfa and stopped at her father's mercantile for supplies. She had been standing behind the counter, her dark hair pinned up in a simple style that somehow made her more beautiful than any elaborate arrangement could have, her green eyes sharp and intelligent as she tallied his order. He had stammered through the transaction like a schoolboy, and she had smiled at him with such warmth that he felt it all the way to his bones. Since then, he had found every excuse to come to Marfa. His ranch was 80 miles north, a hard 2-day ride through unforgiving country, but he made the journey once a month without fail. He would buy supplies he did not need, linger in the mercantile while pretending to consider different types of rope, or which brand of coffee suited him best, and talk with Lydia whenever her father was occupied with other customers or working in the back room. Those conversations had grown from polite exchanges about the weather and cattle prices to something deeper. They talked about books, though neither of them had much education. They talked about the land and what it meant to love a place that could kill you as easily as sustain you. They talked about dreams and fears and all the small observations that make up a life. Yates had fallen in love with her slowly and then all at once, the way a man might walk into quicksand without realizing until he was already sinking. He loved the way she laughed, full and genuine and unafraid. He loved how she could calculate figures faster than any man he knew, how she could discuss the quality of leather goods and the politics of railroad expansion with equal authority. He loved her kindness to the Mexican families who came into the store, how she never shortchanged them or spoke down to them, the way some proprietors did. He loved her courage, the way she had once faced down a drunk cowboy who was harassing a Lipan Apache woman, telling him in a voice like iron that he would conduct himself with decency or get out of her father's establishment. But Lydia Kincaid was a formidable man, built like a bull and twice as stubborn. He had come to Texas in the 50s, survived the war by staying neutral and focusing on his business, and built his mercantile into the most successful store in 3 counties. He was not a man who suffered fools, and he had made it clear on multiple occasions that he had high standards for any man who might court his daughter. Yates had heard the stories. 3 different ranchers' sons had asked permission to court Lydia over the years, and Lawrence had sent them all away with rejections so firm that 2 of them had left Texas entirely out of embarrassment. Yates was not a wealthy man. His ranch was small, just 500 acres that he had claimed and proved up himself, building the house with his own hands and slowly accumulating a herd of longhorns that he drove to market once a year. He had no family name to speak of, no connections that mattered. His father had died when Yates was 12, and his mother had passed 3 years later from a fever that the circuit doctor could not cure. He had raised himself from that point on, working other men's ranches until he was 21, and had saved enough to stake his own claim. He was 26 now, lean and hard from work, his face weathered by sun and wind, his hands calloused and scarred. Nobody thought Lawrence Kincaid would accept him. The men who worked neighboring ranches had told him so directly. The blacksmith in Marfa had shaken his head sadly when Yates had mentioned his intentions last month. Even Lydia herself had warned him, though her eyes had been bright with emotion when she did. "My father is a difficult man," she had said 6 weeks ago during one of Yates's visits. They had been standing outside the mercantile in the early evening, the sky painted orange and purple by the setting sun. "He has refused better men than most, Yates, men with money and land and prospects." "You want me to ask him?" Yates had responded, his heart hammering in his chest. She had been quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Yates had felt his entire future hanging in the balance. Then she had looked at him with those green eyes, and there was something fierce and tender in her expression. "Yes," she had said simply. "Yes, I do." That had been all he needed. He had ridden home that night making plans, and for 6 weeks he had worked like a man possessed. He had finished the addition to his house that he had been building slowly over the past year, 4 new rooms that would be suitable for a family. He had repaired every fence on his property, reshoed all his horses himself to save money, and driven his small herd to an early market where he got a decent price, despite it not being the prime season. He had saved every dollar, spending only what was absolutely necessary, until he had enough money in the bank in Fort Davis to prove he could provide for a wife. And now he was here, riding down the main street of Marfa with the afternoon sun beating down on his shoulders and his heart in his throat. He was here, and he was going to do what everyone said he should not do. He was going to walk into that mercantile and ask Lawrence Kincaid for permission to marry Lydia, and he was not going to leave until he had an answer. Yates dismounted in front of the mercantile, tying his horse to the rail with hands that were steadier than he expected. The animal was exhausted from the journey, foam dried white on its neck and flanks, and Yates took a moment to stroke its nose and promise it water and rest soon. Then he stepped onto the wooden walkway, his boots loud in the afternoon quiet, and pushed open the door. The mercantile smelled of leather and coffee and the dried herbs that hung in bundles from the ceiling beams. It was a large space, shelves stacked high with goods, barrels of flour and sugar and beans lined up along one wall, bolts of fabric arranged by color along another. Lawrence Kincaid was behind the counter, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms, his gray hair and beard neatly trimmed. He was helping an elderly Mexican woman with her purchase, counting out her change with careful precision and speaking to her in slow, clear English. Lydia was there too, arranging canned goods on a shelf near the back. She saw Yates the moment he entered, and the can she was holding nearly slipped from her fingers. Her face went pale and then flushed with color, and Yates saw her hand go to her throat in a gesture of surprise or perhaps anxiety. He nodded to her slightly, then turned his attention to her father. Lawrence looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Yates. "Fitzgerald," he said, his voice neutral. "Did not expect to see you for another 2 weeks." "Mr. Kincaid," Yates replied, removing his hat. His mouth was dry, but he kept his voice steady. "I need to speak with you. It is important." Something in his tone must have conveyed the seriousness of his purpose, because Lawrence's expression shifted from mild curiosity to something more guarded. He finished with the elderly woman, bid her a good day in careful Spanish, and then turned his full attention to Yates. "All right," he said. "What is this about?" Yates glanced toward Lydia, who had stopped pretending to work and was watching them both with wide eyes. He wished they could have this conversation in private, but he also knew that anything he said to Lawrence would reach Lydia within moments anyway. Better to be honest and direct in front of her. Better to let her hear his words herself. "I would like your permission to marry your daughter," Yates said. The words came out clear and firm, stronger than he felt inside. "I have come to ask properly, and to tell you that I can provide for her, that I will work every day of my life to make her happy, and that I love her with everything I am." The silence that followed was profound. Yates heard the clock on the wall ticking, heard someone walking past outside, heard his own pulse thundering in his ears. Lawrence's face had gone hard, his jaw tight, and Yates braced himself for the rejection he had been warned about. But before Lawrence could speak, Lydia's voice cut through the tension. "Papa, please listen to him." Lawrence's head swung toward his daughter, and Yates saw something complicated pass between them, some wordless communication built on years of shared life. Then Lawrence looked back at Yates, and his eyes were sharp as broken glass. "You have a ranch 80 miles north of here," Lawrence said. It was not a question. 500 acres, mostly grassland, small herd of longhorns, maybe 200 head if you have been lucky. A house you built yourself, no hands working for you, no real prospects beyond keeping yourself fed and your cattle alive until market time. "Yes, sir," Yates said. "That is accurate. And you think that is enough to support a wife, to support children, should God bless you with them?" "I do, sir. I have been careful with my money. I have savings. The ranch is modest, but it is mine, free and clear. I owe no man anything, and I am willing to work harder than I ever have to make it prosper." Lawrence crossed his arms over his chest. 3 men with more to offer than you have asked for my daughter's hand in the past 5 years. I turned them all away. What makes you think you are different?" Yates met the older man's gaze without flinching. This was the moment he had prepared for, the question he had expected. "I do not know if I am different, Mr. Kincaid. I only know that I love your daughter and that she matters more to me than my own life. I know that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of her. And I know that I rode 80 miles through dangerous country without hesitation, because asking you for her hand was the most important thing I could possibly do." "Words," Lawrence said dismissively. "Words are cheap, Fitzgerald. Every fool can speak of love when he wants something." "Then let me prove it with action," Yates said, and there was an edge to his voice now, a hardness born of desperation and determination. "Tell me what I need to do, and I will do it. I will work for you for a year without pay if that is what it takes. I will expand my ranch, double my herd, build a house twice the size. Whatever you require, I will accomplish it. Just give me the chance." Lawrence studied him for a long moment, and Yates could not read the expression on the older man's face. Then, surprisingly, Lawrence shook his head. "I do not want grand gestures or promises of future wealth," he said. "I want to know what kind of man you are. I want to know if you will treat my daughter with respect, if you will value her mind as much as her beauty, if you will stand by her when times are hard. Those are things no amount of land or cattle can tell me." "Papa," Lydia said again, moving closer now. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I can tell you what kind of man he is. He is kind and honest. He works hard and does not complain. He has never spoken down to me or treated me as if I were less intelligent than him. He listens when I talk, really listens, and he remembers things I have said weeks later. He is a good man, Papa, one of the best I have ever known." Lawrence looked at his daughter, and Yates saw the man's expression soften slightly. "You want this?" Lawrence asked her. "You truly want to marry this cowboy and go live on a ranch 80 miles from here, away from everything you know?" "I do," Lydia said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. "I love him, Papa. I have loved him for longer than I told you. I want to build a life with him." The older man was quiet for a time that seemed to stretch into eternity. Yates stood there, hat in hand, hardly daring to breathe. Everything he wanted hung in the balance of this moment, and he could do nothing now but wait. Finally, Lawrence sighed, a long exhale that seemed to carry the weight of many years. "You rode 80 miles to ask me this," he said to Yates. "That shows commitment at least. And my daughter is not a fool. If she sees something in you, then perhaps I should trust her judgment." He paused, and then his voice hardened again. "But understand this, Fitzgerald. If you hurt her, if you fail to provide for her, if you prove yourself to be anything less than the man she believes you to be, I will come for you. I am too old to fight, but I am not too old to make your life exceedingly difficult. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir," Yates said, and despite the threat, he felt a surge of hope rising in his chest. "You have my word that I will spend my life proving her right to believe in me." Lawrence looked between Yates and Lydia, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Then you have my permission," he said. "Court her properly for 6 months, and then you may marry with my blessing." Yates felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He had expected refusal, had braced himself for it, and the sudden granting of permission left him momentarily speechless. He looked at Lydia and saw tears streaming down her face, though she was smiling more brilliantly than he had ever seen. "Thank you, sir," Yates managed to say, his own voice rough with emotion. "Thank you. I will not disappoint you, see that you do not," Lawrence said gruffly. Then, surprising them both, he came around the counter and extended his hand. Yates took it, and the older man's grip was firm and strong. "My daughter is the most precious thing in my life," Lawrence said quietly. "Treat her accordingly." "I will, sir, I swear it." Lawrence released his hand and turned to Lydia. "I suppose you will want to talk with him," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone now. "Go on, then, but be back before supper. We have inventory to finish." Lydia nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, and then she was moving toward Yates, and he was moving toward her, and they met in the middle of the mercantile like two rivers converging. He wanted to take her in his arms but held back, aware of her father watching. Instead, he took both her hands in his, and the touch sent warmth flooding through him. "You came," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you would, but part of me was afraid." "I told you I would," Yates said. "I would ride twice as far if that was what it took." "He said yes," Lydia said, as if she could hardly believe it. "Papa said yes." "He did," Yates agreed, and he felt a smile breaking across his face, wide and genuine. 6 months, Lydia. 6 months, and then you will be my wife if you will have me." "I will have you," she said, and she squeezed his hands tightly. "I will have you, Yates Fitzgerald, with all my heart." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and Yates felt a peace settle over him that he had not known in years. The future was still uncertain, still full of the dangers and hardships that came with life on the Texas frontier, but he would face it all with Lydia by his side, and that made everything possible. "Come," Lydia said, gently tugging at his hands. "Let us walk. I want to hear everything about your journey, and I want to tell you everything I have been thinking since last we spoke." They went outside together, into the golden afternoon light, and Yates felt as if he were walking on air. The 6 months ahead would be the longest of his life, he was certain, but they would also be filled with joy, and when they ended, he would marry the woman he loved and begin the life they would build together. It was everything he had hoped for, and more than he had truly believed possible. As they walked down the street, talking quietly and closely, neither of them noticed Lydia Kincaid standing in the doorway of his mercantile, watching them go. The older man's face was unreadable, but after a moment he nodded to himself, as if confirming something, and then went back inside to his work. The 6 months that followed were a strange mixture of hardship and happiness. Yates rode back to his ranch 2 days after receiving Lawrence's permission, his heart lighter than it had been in years despite the exhaustion from the journey. He threw himself into work with renewed energy, determined to make his property as prosperous as possible before the wedding. He spent long days mending fences and building corrals, preparing for the expansion of his herd. He worked on the house too, adding finishing touches to the new rooms, building furniture by hand in the evenings by lamplight. Every month, he made the journey back to Marfa. The 80 miles each way never got easier, but he would have ridden twice that distance without complaint for the chance to see Lydia. They would spend the days he was in town together, always chaperoned either by Lawrence or by Maria Delgado, an older Mexican woman who worked part-time at the mercantile and had known Lydia since she was a child. They would walk through the town, have meals together at the small restaurant that had opened the previous year, sit on the porch of the mercantile in the evening and talk while the sun set. Yates learned so much about Lydia during those visits. He learned that her mother had died when Lydia was 14, a victim of cholera during an outbreak that had swept through West Texas. He learned that Lydia had essentially run the mercantile alongside her father since then, becoming as skilled at business as any man. He learned that she loved to read, that she ordered books from back east whenever the mercantile's profits allowed, and that she had taught herself basic arithmetic and bookkeeping from a manual her father had purchased. He learned that she was lonely sometimes, living in a small town where most of the other young women were already married, or had never learned to see beyond the narrow confines of their expected roles. "I want more than this," she told him one evening in late October as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "I love my father, and I am grateful for the life he has given me, but I want to build something of my own. I want to have a family, children to raise, a home that I make with my own hands alongside my husband. I want to matter in a way that is mine, not just as someone's daughter or someone's shopkeeper." "You matter to me," Yates had said quietly, "more than anything else in this world." She had looked at him then, and even in the dim light he could see the emotion in her eyes. "I know," she had said. "That is why I said yes." The months passed slowly and quickly all at once. Winter came to West Texas, bringing cold winds and occasional freezing rain but little snow. Yates spent Christmas alone on his ranch, but Lydia sent him a gift, a warm wool scarf she had knitted herself, and he wore it constantly even when the weather did not require it. He sent her a gift in return, a delicate silver locket he had purchased from a jeweler in Fort Davis, and she wrote him a letter telling him she wore it every day and would continue to do so for the rest of her life. January brought harsh weather, and Yates lost 3 head of cattle to a particularly brutal cold snap. He mourned the loss, but his herd was still healthy overall, and by February, he had recouped the loss by trading a horse to a neighbor for 4 young steers. March came with warming temperatures and the first signs of spring, new grass pushing up through the hard ground, and Yates felt hope rising with the season. In early April, he made the journey to Marfa with a specific purpose. The 6 months were nearly up, and it was time to set a wedding date. He arrived in town on a warm afternoon, and Lydia met him outside the mercantile with a joy in her face that made the entire journey worthwhile. "May," she said before he could even dismount. "Let us marry in May, as soon as the circuit preacher comes through. I have already spoken to Papa and he agrees." "May it is," Yates said, swinging down from his horse and catching her hands. "I would marry you tomorrow if I could." "May is soon enough," she said, laughing. "I have much to prepare. Maria is making my dress, and I need to finish gathering everything we will need for the house." Papa is giving us supplies from the mercantile as a wedding gift, and I have been making lists for weeks." They set the date for May 20th, when Reverend Thompson was scheduled to pass through Marfa on his monthly circuit. That gave them 6 weeks to prepare, and those weeks flew by in a flurry of activity. Yates made 2 more trips to Marfa during that time, helping to transport supplies and goods that Lydia and Lawrence had assembled. The older man was more generous than Yates had expected, providing not just household supplies but also tools, seed for planting, and a young breeding bull that would improve Yates's herd significantly. "Consider it an investment in my grandchildren's future," Lawrence said gruffly when Yates tried to thank him. "Take care of my daughter, and we will call it even." The wedding day arrived with clear skies and temperatures that were warm but not yet oppressively hot. Yates rode into Marfa the day before, staying at the small boarding house at the edge of town. He barely slept that night, his mind racing with thoughts of the future, with joy and nervousness and a deep sense of rightness. The ceremony was held in the late morning at the small church that served the town. It was not a large gathering. Marfa was still a small community, and many of the attendees were there as much out of curiosity and social obligation as genuine connection to the couple. But there were some true friends. Maria Delgado wept openly throughout the ceremony. 3 neighboring ranchers whom Yates had traded with over the years attended and shook his hand firmly afterward. Lawrence stood stiff and formal in his best suit, walking his daughter down the aisle with obvious pride despite his gruff exterior. But Yates saw only Lydia. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored fabric, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs that Maria had added. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours, small flowers woven through the braids. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that she had gathered herself the previous day, and when she smiled at Yates as she walked toward him, he felt his breath catch in his throat. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony with practiced efficiency, his voice strong despite his advanced age. Yates spoke his vows clearly, meaning every word, promising to love and honor and cherish Lydia for all the days of his life. Lydia's voice was softer but equally firm. Her green eyes locked on his as she made her own promises. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Yates kissed Lydia for the first time as her husband, he felt something fundamental shift in his world, as if everything before this moment had been preparation. And now the real journey was beginning. There was a small celebration afterward at the mercantile, which Lawrence had closed for the day. Tables had been set up outside, loaded with food that the women of the town had prepared. There was roasted beef and fresh bread, beans cooked with spices, dried fruit that had been precious and expensive, and even a small cake that Maria had baked. People ate and talked and offered their congratulations, and Yates shook more hands than he could count. As the afternoon wore on, Yates and Lydia prepared to leave. They would spend their wedding night at the boarding house, and then in the morning they would begin the journey to the ranch that would be their home. Yates had arranged for a wagon to transport Lydia's belongings and the supplies from Lawrence, and he had brought one of his gentler horses for Lydia to ride. When it was time to say goodbye, Lawrence pulled his daughter aside. Yates watched from a respectful distance as father and daughter spoke quietly together. He saw Lydia embrace Lawrence tightly, saw the older man's face contort with emotion before he mastered it. When they separated, Lawrence walked over to Yates and extended his hand once more. "She is your responsibility now," Lawrence said, his voice rough. "But she will always be my daughter. Take care of her, Fitzgerald." "With my life, sir," Yates said, and he meant it absolutely. They left Marfa in the golden light of late afternoon, riding toward the boarding house with the wagon following behind. Driven by a young man Lawrence had hired for the purpose. Yates and Lydia rode side by side, and every time he looked over at her, he marveled at the reality that she was now his wife, that they would spend the rest of their lives together. That night, in the simple room at the boarding house, they consummated their marriage with tenderness and care. Yates had been with women before, encounters in his younger days that he did not dwell on, but this was different in every way. This was Lydia, the woman he loved, and their union felt sacred despite its physical nature. Afterward, they lay together in the narrow bed, Lydia's head resting on his chest, and talked quietly about the future until they finally drifted into sleep. They began the journey to the ranch at dawn. The 80 miles stretched before them, and Yates had planned the trip carefully, knowing that Lydia was not accustomed to such long rides. They would travel in stages, camping one night along the way, taking their time. The young man with the wagon would accompany them for the journey, and then ride back to Marfa with the wagon once everything was unloaded. The first day of travel went smoothly. The weather held clear, and they made good progress despite stopping frequently to rest the horses and allow Lydia to stretch her legs. They talked as they rode, Yates pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the land, Lydia sharing more memories of her childhood and her mother. When evening came, they made camp near a small creek that Yates knew from previous journeys. He built a fire while Lydia unpacked food from their supplies, and they ate together as the sun set and the stars emerged. "Are you frightened?" Yates asked her as they sat by the fire. "About living so far from town, from your father and everything you know?" Lydia considered the question seriously. "A little," she admitted. "But mostly I am excited. I trust you, Yates. I know the life will be hard, but I am not afraid of hard work. And I would rather build something real with you in the middle of nowhere than have an easy life with someone I did not love." Yates reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We will build something good," he promised. "It will take time and there will be struggles, but we will do it together." They slept that night under the stars, wrapped in blankets near the fire, and Yates woke several times just to look at Lydia sleeping beside him, still half convinced that this was all a dream. The second day brought them to the ranch. Yates's heart beat faster as they crested the final rise and his property came into view. The house stood solid and strong, the new addition making it larger and more impressive than it had been. The corrals and outbuildings were in good repair. His cattle were visible in the distance, grazing peacefully. It was not grand by any means, but it was his, and now it was Lydia's too. "This is it," he said, gesturing toward the property. "This is home." Lydia smiled, and there was genuine pleasure in her expression. "It is beautiful," she said. "Show me everything." They spent the rest of the day unloading the wagon and settling in. Yates gave Lydia a tour of the house, showing her the main room with its stone fireplace, the kitchen with its wood stove, the bedroom he had prepared specially for them with a large bed frame he had built himself. He showed her the 3 other rooms that would eventually be for children, though they were empty now except for some stored supplies. He showed her the barn and the corrals, explained his plans for expanding the herd and improving the grazing land. Lydia took it all in with sharp attention, asking intelligent questions about water sources and feed supplies and market access. She was not merely admiring the property out of wifely duty. She was genuinely interested, already thinking about how to make things work better, how to contribute to their success. That evening, after the young man from Marfa had departed with the empty wagon, Yates and Lydia sat on the porch of their house and watched the sun set over the land that was now theirs together. Yates put his arm around his wife and she leaned into him, and for a long moment they simply existed in the peace of that connection. "Nobody thought you would do it," Lydia said quietly. "Nobody thought you would ride 80 miles to ask my father for my hand. They all said you were foolish, that Papa would refuse you like he refused the others." "I know," Yates said, "but I had to try, I had to ask. You were worth any risk, any rejection." "And now we are here," Lydia said, wonder in her voice. "We are married, and this is our home, and we have our whole lives ahead of us." "Now we are here," Yates agreed, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And I will spend every day of that life making sure you never regret choosing me." Lydia turned in his arms so she could look at him directly. Her green eyes were bright in the fading light, and her expression was fierce and tender all at once. "I could never regret it," she said. "You are the best man I have ever known, Yates Fitzgerald, and I am proud to be your wife." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of promise and hope. And when they finally pulled apart, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky above them. Yates stood and offered his hand to Lydia, and together they went inside their house, closing the door on the night and beginning the private life they would share. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Lydia adapted to ranch life with a determination that impressed Yates daily. She learned to cook on the wood stove, experimenting until she mastered it. She learned about caring for horses and tending the vegetable garden that Yates helped her plant. She learned to mend fences and brand cattle, insisting that she should understand every aspect of the work that sustained them. But she also brought her own skills to their partnership. She took over the ranch's financial records, organizing everything with a precision that made Yates realize how haphazard his previous methods had been. She identified areas where they could save money or negotiate better prices. She suggested improvements to the house and the property that Yates would never have thought of himself. She wrote letters to her father regularly, maintaining that connection, and Lawrence began sending business advice along with his personal correspondence. The physical distance was hard for Lydia at times. She missed her father, missed the society of town even as small as Marfa was, missed having other women to talk with. Yates saw her loneliness and tried to ease it by talking with her for hours in the evenings, by encouraging her to pursue her reading and other interests, by making the journey to Marfa every 6 weeks so she could visit her father and Maria. But there was also joy in their isolation. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, learned to work together smoothly, learned the intimate details of sharing a life. They made love frequently and with increasing ease, their physical connection deepening as their emotional bond strengthened. They talked about their dreams and fears, about the children they hoped to have, about the future of the ranch and what they might achieve together. Summer came with brutal heat, and they worked through it side by side. Autumn brought relief, and the cattle drive to market, where Yates got good prices and came home with money that they could invest in improvements. Winter was mild that year, and they spent the cold evenings by the fire, Lydia reading aloud from books while Yates worked on various repair projects. In February of their second year of marriage, Lydia missed her monthly courses. At first she said nothing, not wanting to raise false hope, but when the same thing happened the following month and she began experiencing nausea in the mornings, she told Yates her suspicion. His joy was immediate and overwhelming, and he held her carefully as if she might break, promising to take care of her and their child with everything he had. They made the journey to Marfa in April so that Lydia could confirm her pregnancy with Dr. Pierce, who had set up practice in the town the previous year. The doctor examined her and confirmed that she was indeed with child, due in late October or early November. Lawrence wept when they told him, not bothering to hide his tears, and he gave Lydia a fierce embrace that spoke of his love and his fears for her. "Write to me often," Lawrence insisted. "And if there are any problems, any complications, you send for me immediately. I will come, no matter the distance." "I will, Papa," Lydia promised. "But I am strong, and I have Yates with me. We will be fine." The pregnancy progressed well through the spring and summer. Lydia continued to work as much as she could, though Yates insisted she avoid the heaviest tasks. He hired a hand for the season, a young cowboy named Tom who was competent and respectful, and who took on much of the physical labor so that Lydia could rest. She chafed at the restriction sometimes, but understood its necessity. As her belly grew, Yates found himself marveling constantly at the reality of the child growing inside her. He would place his hand on her stomach and feel the baby move, tiny kicks and shifts that filled him with wonder. They spent evenings discussing names, what kind of parents they wanted to be, how they would teach their children to be strong and kind and honest. In early October, Yates sent word to Marfa that the baby would be coming soon, and Lawrence made the journey to their ranch, bringing Maria with him to assist with the birth. It was the first time Lydia's father had seen their property, and Yates gave him a tour while the women talked inside. Lawrence inspected everything with a critical eye but nodded approval at what he saw. "You have done well," Lawrence said finally. "The ranch is prospering, and my daughter looks happy despite her condition. You have kept your promises, Fitzgerald." "I intend to keep them for the rest of my life," Yates replied. The baby came on November 3rd, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the morning. Yates stayed with Lydia throughout, holding her hand and speaking words of encouragement even when fear for her safety threatened to overwhelm him. Maria and Lawrence both assisted, Maria with the practical knowledge of having attended many births, Lawrence with his steady presence and quiet support. When the baby finally arrived, filling the house with its first cries, Yates felt tears streaming down his face. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with a good set of lungs and his mother's dark hair already visible on his small head. Maria cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft cloth, and then placed him in Lydia's arms. Lydia looked exhausted but radiant, and when she looked up at Yates with tears of joy on her face, he felt his heart expand with more love than he had known was possible. "We have a son," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We have a son," Yates repeated, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead and then gently touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers curled reflexively around his, and Yates felt the weight of responsibility and love settle over him like a mantle. They named the boy Thomas Lawrence Fitzgerald, Thomas for no particular reason except that they both liked the name, and Lawrence for his grandfather. The older man had tried to protest that it was not necessary, but Lydia had insisted, and when she placed the baby in her father's arms, Lawrence had looked down at his grandson with such tenderness that everyone in the room felt the power of that moment. Lawrence and Maria stayed for 2 weeks, helping with the baby and the household while Lydia recovered her strength. Yates was grateful beyond words for their presence, for Lawrence's steady competence and Maria's gentle care. When they finally left to return to Marfa, promising to visit again soon, Yates and Lydia were left alone with their son, and the reality of parenthood settled over them fully. Those first months with Thomas were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby demanded constant attention, waking multiple times each night to feed, needing to be changed and held and comforted. Yates and Lydia took turns caring for him, stumbling through the days in a haze of fatigue but sustained by the joy of watching their son grow. Thomas was a good baby overall, healthy and developing well. And as the weeks passed, they gradually found their rhythm as parents, Spring came again, and Yates threw himself into the work of the ranch with renewed determination. He had a family to support now, a son who would inherit this land someday, and that gave even the hardest work a sense of purpose and meaning. He expanded his herd further, building his cattle numbers toward the goal of 1,000 head that would make the ranch truly prosperous. He repaired and improved the house, adding a proper porch across the front and enlarging the kitchen. He planted more of the land with crops that would supplement their food supply and provide feed for the animals through the winter. Lydia managed the household with the same competence she brought to everything, caring for Thomas while also maintaining the records and helping with the ranch work whenever possible. She wrote to her father regularly, and Lawrence's responses were full of advice and questions about his grandson. Twice more that year, they made the journey to Marfa so that Lawrence could see Thomas, and each time the older man seemed to age a bit more, but his love for his family remained as strong as ever. The years passed, each bringing its own challenges and blessings. When Thomas was 2, Lydia became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Ruth. 2 years after that came another son, William. The house that had once seemed spacious now felt full of life and noise, children running and playing, learning to help with small tasks around the ranch. Yates watched his children grow with a wonder that never faded. He taught Thomas to ride when the boy was 5, patiently guiding him through the basics until he could sit a horse confidently. He showed all his children how to care for animals, how to mend fences and rope cattle, how to read the weather and the land. But he also encouraged them to learn from their mother, who taught them reading and arithmetic, and all the lessons that would help them navigate the world beyond the ranch. Lydia blossomed as a mother and as a partner in building their life. The loneliness of those early years had faded, replaced by the constant companionship of children and the deep satisfaction of watching what they had created together grow and thrive. She still missed her father, especially as he grew older and the journey between Marfa and the ranch became harder for him, but they visited when they could and wrote often. In the spring of their 10th year of marriage, Lydia Kincaid became ill with a fever that would not break. Lydia received the letter from Maria and immediately insisted that they travel to Marfa, all of them, despite the difficulty of making the journey with 3 young children. Yates agreed without argument, knowing that Lydia needed to be with her father. They arrived to find Lawrence bedridden but conscious. Dr. Pierce had done what he could, but the fever had weakened the older man significantly, and there was an air of finality about the situation that everyone felt but no one wanted to speak aloud. Lydia spent hours at her father's bedside, talking with him quietly, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing as they shared memories. On the 3rd day, Lawrence called Yates into the room alone. The older man looked frail in the bed, but his eyes were still sharp, still intense. "Fitzgerald," Lawrence said, his voice weak. "Come closer." Yates approached and sat in the chair beside the bed. "Yes, sir, I am dying," Lawrence said bluntly. "We both know it. Before I go, I need to tell you something." "You do not need to say anything," Yates began, but Lawrence waved his hand weakly. "Let an old man speak," Lawrence said. "When you came to me 11 years ago and asked for my daughter's hand, I was ready to refuse you. I had refused better prospects, wealthier men, men with family names that meant something. But then I saw the way you looked at her, and the way she looked at you, and I remembered what it was like to love that completely. My wife and I had that, you see. She was the light of my life, and when she died, part of me died with her. I could not deny my daughter the chance at that same kind of love, even if it meant letting her go to a life that was harder than I would have chosen for her." "Sir, I do not know what to say," Yates said, emotion thick in his throat. "Do not say anything," Lawrence replied. "Just listen. You have exceeded every hope I had. You have been a good husband to Lydia, a good father to your children, and a man of honor in all your dealings. I am proud to call you my son-in-law, and I am grateful that my daughter has had you by her side all these years. When I am gone, the mercantile will go to Lydia. It is written in my will. I know you are happy on your ranch, and I do not expect you to give that up, but the store is valuable and will provide security for your family. Do with it what seems best." "Thank you," Yates said, his voice rough, "for everything. For trusting me with Lydia, for accepting me into your family, for all the kindness you have shown us over the years." Lawrence smiled weakly. "You rode 80 miles to ask for her hand," he said. "That took courage. I respected it then, and I respect it now. Take care of them, Fitzgerald. Take care of my daughter and my grandchildren." "I will," Yates promised. "With my life." Lawrence died that night, peacefully in his sleep, with Lydia holding his hand. The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by most of the town and many from the surrounding area. Lawrence Kincaid had been a fixture of Marfa for over 20 years, respected and liked by nearly everyone, and his passing marked the end of an era. Lydia grieved deeply, but with a quiet strength that reminded Yates of her father. She mourned, but she did not break, and as the days passed she began to make decisions about the mercantile and the future. She and Yates discussed the options carefully. They could sell the store, which would bring a significant sum of money. They could hire a manager to run it while they remained on the ranch. Or they could move to Marfa and run the mercantile themselves, giving up the ranch life. In the end, they chose a middle path. They hired a competent manager, a young man named Samuel Cruz, who had worked for Lawrence for several years and knew the business well. Samuel would run the store on a daily basis, sending monthly reports and profits to Yates and Lydia, and they would travel to Marfa several times a year to check on operations and make major decisions. It was not a perfect solution, but it allowed them to maintain their ranch while also honoring Lawrence's legacy and providing additional income for their growing family. Life continued, the rhythm of seasons and years marking the passage of time. The children grew, each developing their own personality and interests. Thomas became a skilled cowboy like his father, taking on more responsibility with the cattle and the land. Ruth showed her mother's head for business, learning to help Lydia with the ranch accounts even as a young girl. William was the dreamer of the family, more interested in books and stories than in cattle, and though Yates sometimes wondered if the boy would want to stay on the ranch when he grew up, he supported his son's interests without judgment. The ranch prospered under their careful management. The herd grew to over 1,000 head, and Yates hired additional hands to help with the work. They expanded the house again, adding a second floor with more bedrooms and a proper study where Lydia could work on the accounts and correspondence. The land itself improved under their stewardship, careful grazing practices and water management making the grass healthier and more abundant. In their 15th year of marriage, Lydia gave birth to one more child, a daughter they named Grace. The baby was unexpected, coming years after they had assumed their family was complete. But she was welcomed with joy and quickly became the darling of the entire family. Her older siblings doted on her, and Yates found that being a father to a baby again at 41 was different than it had been at 26, less anxious but no less wonderful. The mercantile in Marfa continued to operate successfully under Samuel's management. The young man proved himself capable and honest, sending regular reports and consulting with Lydia on major decisions. The profits from the store supplemented the ranch income significantly, allowing them to weather bad years without hardship and to invest in improvements during good years. Yates and Lydia's love deepened with each passing year, maturing from the passionate intensity of their youth into something steadier but no less profound. They knew each other completely, understood each other's moods and needs without words, moved through their days in a partnership that was both romantic and practical. They still made love regularly, still found joy in each other's company, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. On their 20th anniversary, Yates surprised Lydia with a trip to Marfa, arranging for the older children to watch the younger ones so that they could have a few days alone together. They stayed at the hotel that had been built 5 years earlier, ate at the restaurant, walked through the town that had grown considerably since their wedding day. Yates bought Lydia a beautiful shawl from a new shop that sold goods from Mexico, and Lydia bought Yates a fine leather saddle from the harness maker. On the evening of their actual anniversary, they sat together on the hotel balcony watching the sunset, much as they had sat on their own porch so many times over the years. "You ever regret it?" Yates asked, the question coming from nowhere but somehow feeling necessary. "Do you ever wish you had married someone wealthier, someone who could have given you an easier life?" Lydia looked at him with surprise, and then her expression softened into something tender. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once, not even for a moment. You gave me everything I wanted, Yates. A life with meaning, children to love, a partnership where I am valued and respected. You gave me yourself, your loyalty and your love and your devotion, and those things are worth more than any amount of wealth. I chose you, and I would choose you again every day for the rest of my life." Yates felt emotion swell in his chest, as powerful as it had been on their wedding day. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I am the luckiest man alive," he said. "To have you, to have built this life with you, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." "We built it together," Lydia corrected gently. "That is what makes it special. It is ours, something we created with our own hands and our own choices." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, watching the light fade from the sky and the stars emerge, hands clasped together, content in the life they had made. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both joyful and sorrowful. Thomas married at 23, choosing a young woman from a neighboring ranch, and Yates helped his son build a house on a portion of the family land. Watching Thomas start his own family filled Yates with pride and a sense of continuity, knowing that the work he and Lydia had done would continue into the next generation. Ruth, at 18, surprised everyone by announcing that she wanted to attend a teaching college in San Antonio. It was an unusual choice for a rancher's daughter, but Yates and Lydia supported her decision, using some of the mercantile profits to pay for her education. She left with their blessing and returned 2 years later with a teaching certificate, eventually establishing a school in Marfa that served the children of the growing town. William, true to his dreamer nature, became a writer, contributing articles to newspapers in Fort Worth and Dallas about life in West Texas. He stayed on the ranch but made his living with words rather than cattle, and Yates eventually came to appreciate that his son was preserving their way of life in a different way, recording stories and experiences that might otherwise be lost. Grace, the youngest, grew into a beautiful and spirited young woman who loved the ranch life as much as her father did. She learned to ride expertly, could rope cattle as well as any man, and showed a natural talent for training horses. When she was 20, a young cowboy who worked on the ranch began courting her with Yates's permission, and Yates watched the development of that relationship with memories of his own courtship of Lydia. Time was kind to Yates and Lydia overall, though it brought the inevitable marks of age. Yates's dark hair turned gray and then white, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. Lydia's beauty matured into something distinguished and elegant, her green eyes still sharp and bright. They both suffered the aches and pains of bodies that had worked hard for many years, but they remained healthy and active, still managing the ranch even as they delegated more responsibility to their children and hired hands. In the winter of their 30th year of marriage, on a cold evening with snow falling gently outside, Yates and Lydia sat together by the fire in their home. The house was quiet. The children were all grown and living their own lives now, though they visited often. It was just the two of them as it had been in the beginning, and there was a rightness to that. "You remember when I rode 80 miles to ask your father for your hand?" Yates asked, his voice soft in the quiet room. Lydia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Of course I remember. How could I forget? It was the bravest thing anyone had ever done for me." "Everyone said I was a fool," Yates said. "They said your father would never accept me, that I was wasting my time and effort. But you came anyway," Lydia said. "You came because you loved me, and because you believed it was worth trying even if you might fail. That is who you are, Yates. That is who you have always been." "And your father said yes," Yates continued, marveling still at the memory. "He gave me a chance, and I have spent the last 30 years trying to prove worthy of his trust and your love." "You proved it long ago," Lydia said firmly. "Every day, in 1,000 small ways and a few large ones, you have shown me who you are. You have been my partner, my love, my best friend. You have been a wonderful father to our children and a good man in all your dealings. Papa would be proud of you, as I am proud of you." Yates wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I would do it all again," he said. "Every mile of that journey, every challenge we have faced, every moment of hardship and joy. I would do it all again for the privilege of this life with you." "As would I," Lydia said, and she turned her head to kiss him softly. "We have been blessed, you and I. We found each other. We built something real and lasting, and we have loved well. What more could anyone ask for?" They sat together in the firelight, two people who had given their lives to each other and to the land, who had weathered every storm together and come through stronger for it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the Texas plains in white, and inside the fire burned warm and bright, a symbol of the enduring love that had sustained them through 3 decades of marriage. The ranch would continue after them, passed down to their children and grandchildren. The mercantile in Marfa would continue to serve the town, a lasting legacy of Lydia Kincaid and his vision. But the real legacy was something that could not be seen or touched, something that existed in the bonds of family, and the memory of a love story that began with a cowboy who rode 80 miles through dangerous country, because he believed his love was worth any risk, and a woman who saw in him everything she had ever wanted. That legacy would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the power of courage and devotion, and the simple, profound act of choosing each other against all expectations. Years later, when Yates was in his late 60s and Lydia was a few years younger, they would sometimes sit on their porch in the evening and watch their grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas's children and Grace's children, running and laughing, growing up on the same land where their parents had been raised. Ruth would visit from town, bringing stories of her students and the school she had built. William would read them passages from his latest article, or his work on a book about the settling of West Texas. In those moments, Yates would look at Lydia and see the girl she had been, standing behind the counter of her father's mercantile with her sharp mind and her warm smile. He would see the young bride who had ridden 80 miles to start a new life with him. He would see the mother who had raised their children with patience and wisdom. He would see every version of her all at once, layered like the rings in a tree, and his love for her would fill him completely. And Lydia, looking back at him, would see the nervous young cowboy who had walked into the mercantile and asked for her father's permission, who had promised to spend his life making her happy. She would see the husband who had worked himself to exhaustion building their home, who had held her hand through the births of their children, who had been her partner in every decision and every challenge. She would see the man he had become and the man he had always been, and she would know with absolute certainty that she had chosen well. On a warm spring day in their 38th year of marriage, Yates and Lydia celebrated their anniversary with a gathering of their entire family. All 4 of their children were there, along with their spouses and children. The house overflowed with people. 3 generations gathered together to honor the love that had started it all. They ate and talked and laughed, sharing stories and making new memories. At one point in the afternoon, Yates stood up and raised his glass, calling for everyone's attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. 38 years ago, Yates said, his voice still strong despite his age, I rode 80 miles to Marfa to ask Lydia Kincaid for permission to marry his daughter. Everyone told me I was a fool, that he would refuse me, that I was not good enough for her. And they were right about one thing. I was not good enough for her then, and I am not good enough for her now. But her father gave me a chance anyway, and Lydia chose me despite all the reasons she might have chosen differently. Everything good in my life, everything that matters, comes from that choice and from the life we have built together. He paused, looking at Lydia, who was watching him with tears in her eyes. I have never regretted a single moment, not 1 mile of that journey or any of the challenges we have faced. You are the great love of my life, Lydia Fitzgerald, and I am grateful every day that you said yes to me. There was not a dry eye in the room as Yates sat down, and Lydia reached over to take his hand, squeezing it tightly. Their children applauded, and then Thomas stood to offer his own toast, and the afternoon continued in that warm glow of family love. As the sun began to set and guests started to depart, Yates and Lydia found themselves alone on the porch once more. It was their favorite place, the spot where they had shared so many conversations over the years, where they had watched their children grow and their land prosper. 80 miles, Lydia said softly, almost to herself. You rode 80 miles for me. I would have ridden twice that, Yates replied, as he had said so many times before. I would have ridden to the end of the earth if that was what it took. I know, Lydia said, and she leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, fitting perfectly into the space that seemed made for her. That is why I love you. Not because of the grand gestures, though they matter, but because you mean what you say. You promised me a life of love and partnership, and you have given me exactly that, every single day. They sat together as darkness fell, 2 people who had given each other everything and had received everything in return. The ranch was quiet around them, the land peaceful under the emerging stars. Their children and grandchildren were safe and happy, their legacy secured. The life they had built together stood as testament to what was possible when 2 people chose each other and committed fully to that choice. Yates Fitzgerald had ridden 80 miles through dangerous country to ask for the hand of the woman he loved, defying everyone's expectations and proving that sometimes the greatest courage is found in following your heart. And Lydia Kincaid had said yes, choosing a life of partnership and love over easier paths, trusting in the man she saw beneath the weathered cowboy exterior. Together, they had built something that would outlast them both. A family that spread across the Texas plains, a ranch that thrived under their careful stewardship, a love story that would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, as an example of what it means to commit fully to another person. They had faced hardships and celebrated joys, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, and through it all they had stood together, hands clasped, hearts united. As the years continued to advance, and they both moved into their 70s, their lives took on a gentle quality, the pace slowing but the contentment deepening. They spent their days in simple pleasures, working in Lydia's garden, riding slowly across their land to check on cattle and fences, sitting together in the evening while Lydia read aloud, and Yates worked on small repair projects. They wrote letters to their children and received regular visits from family. They attended church services in Marfa when the weather allowed and their health permitted. They lived quietly but richly, surrounded by the fruits of a lifetime of labor and love. On a summer evening in their 42nd year of marriage, when Yates was 70 and Lydia was 67, they sat together on their porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and red. They had seen thousands of sunsets together over the years, but each one still felt special, still moved them with its beauty. "I have been thinking," Lydia said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "about that day you walked into Papa's mercantile and asked for my hand. Do you remember how nervous you were? I remember thinking my heart was going to beat right out of my chest," Yates admitted with a soft laugh. "I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times on the ride to Marfa, but when I actually stood there facing your father, all those careful words just vanished." "But you did it anyway," Lydia said. "That is what has always amazed me about you, Yates. When something matters, when something is important, you find the courage even when you are afraid." "You made it easy," Yates replied. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. Everything else, all the work and the challenges, that was just details. The love was always simple." Lydia reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "We have had a good life," she said. "A better life than I ever imagined for myself when I was young and standing behind that counter day after day. You gave me that, Yates. You gave me adventure and partnership and a love that has sustained me through everything." "We gave it to each other," Yates said, squeezing her hand gently. "That is what makes it real. It was not just me doing something for you or you doing something for me. It was us together, building something neither of us could have built alone." They sat in silence after that, watching as the sun finally slipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. The air cooled, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. A night-bird called, its voice clear in the gathering darkness. "If I had it to do over again," Yates said finally, his voice thoughtful, "if I could go back to that day when I was 26, and everyone was telling me not to bother, that your father would never accept me, I would not change a single thing. I would ride those 80 miles again. I would walk into that mercantile with my heart in my throat. I would ask for your hand knowing that I might be refused, because even the possibility of this life with you was worth any risk. And I would say yes again," Lydia said firmly. "Every time, in every version of our story, I would choose you. You have been the great adventure of my life, Yates Fitzgerald, and I am grateful for every moment we have shared." They kissed then, a gentle touch of lips that held within it all the passion and tenderness of 42 years together. When they pulled apart, Yates helped Lydia to her feet, and together they went inside their home, the house they had built and filled with love, to spend another evening together as they had spent so many before. The story of the cowboy who rode 80 miles to ask for his love's hand had become legend in that part of Texas. Their children told it to their children, who would tell it to theirs. In Marfa, old-timers still remembered Lawrence Kincaid's surprise when the young cowboy had actually been accepted, still talked about the wedding and how beautiful Lydia had looked. On ranches throughout the region, men still pointed to Yates Fitzgerald as an example of what determination and true love could accomplish. But for Yates and Lydia themselves, the story was not about legend or example. It was simply their life, the real and ordinary existence they had shared for over 4 decades. It was morning coffee and evening conversations, working side by side through scorching summers and bitter winters, raising children and building a business and caring for each other through sickness and health. It was laughter and tears, triumphs and setbacks, the mundane and the magnificent all woven together into the fabric of a shared existence. As they moved into their late 70s and early 80s, they relied increasingly on their children and grandchildren for help with the heavy work of the ranch. Thomas had essentially taken over operations, though he always consulted with his parents on major decisions out of respect and wisdom. Ruth visited often from Marfa, bringing news from town and helping her mother with household tasks. William came less frequently, living in Dallas now where his writing career had flourished, but he wrote long letters and visited several times a year. Grace lived on the neighboring property with her husband and children, close enough to help whenever needed. Yates's body began to slow, arthritis making his hands stiff and his joints ache, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Lydia never wavered. Lydia's vision began to fail, making reading difficult, but Yates would read to her in the evenings as she once had read to him, their roles reversing with the easy flexibility of true partnership. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a grand party that brought together over 100 people, family and friends from across the region. A photographer came from Marfa to take formal portraits, and the image of Yates and Lydia sitting together, his hand on her shoulder, both of them smiling with genuine joy, would become a treasured family heirloom. During the speeches at that anniversary celebration, Thomas stood and spoke about what his parents' marriage had taught him. "They showed us," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day. They showed us that partnership means working together toward common goals, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating each other's victories. They showed us that commitment means staying even when things are hard, choosing each other again and again through all the seasons of life." Papa rode 80 miles to ask for Mama's hand, but the real journey was the one they took together in the 50 years since then. Ruth spoke too, tears streaming down her face, about how her mother's strength and intelligence had inspired her own choices, how seeing her parents' equal partnership had given her the courage to pursue education and a career. William read a passage from an essay he had written about his parents' love story, his words painting a portrait of their relationship that moved everyone in attendance to tears. Grace simply embraced her parents tightly and whispered that she hoped to love her own husband as completely as they loved each other. Through it all, Yates and Lydia sat together, hands clasped, accepting the love and admiration of their family with grace and humility. They had not set out to be examples or legends. They had simply loved each other as fully and honestly as they knew how, and that love had created ripples that extended far beyond themselves. As the evening wound down and guests departed, Yates and Lydia found themselves once more on their porch, the place that had seen so many of their most important conversations. The night was warm and clear, stars blazing overhead in profusion, and for a long time they simply sat in comfortable silence. 50 years, Lydia said finally, wonder in her voice. "We have been married for 50 years, Yates, How is that possible? It seems like just yesterday that you walked into Papa's store, and yet it also feels like we have been together forever. I know what you mean, Yates replied. Time is strange that way. The years fly by, but when I look back, I can remember so many moments with perfect clarity. I remember the way you looked at me on our wedding day. I remember holding Thomas for the first time. I remember building this house, planting that garden, driving cattle to market. All of it is right there, as fresh as if it happened yesterday. We have lived a full life, Lydia said softly. We have loved deeply, worked hard, raised good children, and built something that will endure after we are gone. What more could anyone ask for? Nothing, Yates said simply. Nothing at all. You have given me everything I ever wanted and so much I never knew to want. You have been my partner, my love, my home. Whatever time we have left, I am grateful for every moment of it. Lydia turned to look at him, and even in the dim light he could see the emotion in her eyes. I love you, she said, her voice thick with feeling. I have loved you since the day you first walked into the mercantile and stammered through buying rope you did not need. I loved you when you rode 80 miles to ask Papa for my hand. I loved you when we stood before Reverend Thompson and made our vows. And I love you now after 50 years together with the same intensity but deeper understanding. You are the best choice I ever made, Yates Fitzgerald. And you are mine, Yates replied, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. The very best choice, the only choice that mattered. They embraced there on the porch, two elderly people holding each other with all the tenderness of a lifetime together, and the stars above seemed to shine more brightly in celebration of their love. The final years of their lives together were gentle ones, marked by increasing frailty but also by a profound sense of completeness. They knew they had lived well, had loved fully, had left a legacy that would continue through their children and grandchildren. When the end came, as it inevitably must for everyone, they faced it together as they had faced everything else. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 86, with Lydia lying beside him as she had for nearly 60 years of marriage. When she woke that morning and realized he was gone, she did not weep or wail. Instead, she lay there for a long moment with her hand on his chest, feeling grateful for every year, every day, every moment they had shared. Thank you, she whispered to him, though he could no longer hear. Thank you for riding 80 miles to ask for my hand. Thank you for all the years since then. Thank you for loving me so well. Lydia followed him 6 months later, her body simply giving up once the partner who had sustained her for so long was gone. Her children were with her at the end, gathered around her bed in the house their parents had built, and her final words were of Yates and of her love for him. Tell him I am coming, she said to Thomas, her breathing labored. Tell him to wait for me. And then, with a smile on her face, she let go and was gone. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with headstones that bore simple inscriptions. Yates's read, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, he rode far for love and found everything he sought. Lydia's read, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she chose wisely and loved completely. Their story lived on, passed down through generations as an example of true love and commitment. Their ranch continued to operate under the management of Thomas's children and grandchildren. The land they had claimed and proved still producing cattle and supporting family. The mercantile in Marfa eventually closed as the town modernized and changed, but Ruth's school continued, educating new generations of West Texas children. William's writings preserved the details of frontier life and of his parents' remarkable partnership. Grace's descendants carried on the family tradition of ranching and the values their great-grandparents had instilled. But the real legacy was simpler and more profound than any institution or property. It was the example of two people who had chosen each other against the odds, who had worked together to build a life of meaning and purpose, who had loved faithfully through all the challenges and joys of more than half a century together. It was the reminder that courage and commitment and genuine partnership could create something beautiful and lasting, even in the harsh landscape of the West Texas plains. The story of the cowboy who rode 80 miles to face his beloved's father and ask for her hand, defying everyone's expectations and winning his heart's desire through determination and genuine love, became part of family lore and regional legend. But for those who truly knew Yates and Lydia Fitzgerald, the real story was not in that single bold action, but in the thousands of small choices they made every day thereafter, choosing each other, supporting each other, building together the life they had promised on their wedding day. That was the true romance, the real love story, and it was one that would inspire all who heard it to believe in the transformative power of commitment and devotion. Their descendants would gather at the ranch on anniversaries of significant events, standing by the graves on the hill and telling the stories again. Young couples would hear about Yates's 80-mile ride and Lydia's courage in choosing a difficult life with the man she loved, and they would be inspired in their own relationships. Children would learn about their ancestors' dedication to each other and to their family, and those lessons would shape them as they grew. Time moved on, as it always does, bringing new challenges and new joys to each generation. But the foundation that Yates and Lydia had laid, built on love and respect and partnership, remained solid beneath it all. Their marriage had been the cornerstone upon which everything else was built, and that cornerstone proved strong enough to support generations of family and love. In the end, theirs was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the wild and dangerous frontier, but rooted in the timeless truths of human connection and devotion. It proved that sometimes the greatest adventures are not about conquering land or accumulating wealth, but about finding the person who completes you, and then building a life together that honors the love you share. And it showed that true romance is not just in the grand gestures, important though those may be, but in the everyday choice to love and support and cherish the person you have chosen as your partner through all the seasons of life. Yates Fitzgerald rode 80 miles to ask for Lydia Kincaid's hand in marriage, and in doing so, he started a journey that would span more than half a century and touch countless lives. But the journey itself was never about the destination. It was about the traveling together, hand in hand, heart to heart, through whatever joys and sorrows life might bring. And in that journey, they found everything that truly matters: love, partnership, family, and a legacy of devotion that would endure long after they themselves had passed from this world into whatever lies beyond. Their story was complete, their love fulfilled, their lives well lived. And that, in the end, is the happiest ending any love story can have.